Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm Amanda Herman, the Education Curator at the University Museum of Contemporary Art. We're so glad you're here tonight, and I'm excited for what I'm sure will be a compelling discussion this evening. We want to begin this event by acknowledging that UMass Amherst stands on traditional Nonotuck land, and we recognize our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and the Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. We have a great group of speakers tonight gathered here to discuss how museums can invite in those who might not normally visit and assist in transforming our institutions to be more inclusive. We'll soon hear from one of the co-creators of Look at Art, Get Paid, Josephine Devanbu, whose project offers an innovative model for how institutions can make these changes and how they can expand their audience and dismantle structural racism that often exists in museums. I first heard Josephine speak about her project at a conference in 2018, shortly after starting my position at the UMCA, and I was immediately struck with the strength of the idea to address what I knew was a persistent problem in art museums. They decided to pay community members for their time and ask them to critique the museum, providing valuable feedback to an institution about how others experience their space. When I came back to UMass, I discussed the idea with Karen Kurczynski, a UMass art history professor and a great partner of UMCA, who I've had the pleasure of working with on many outreach projects. The idea resonated with her deep interest in expanding who museums serve. And together we dreamt up an idea of replicating the idea or being inspired by the idea and hosting a series of conversations at the UMCA. She invited in Sid Ferrer to join her, and along with many UMass students, they gathered at the museum, and she'll tell you more about that project. I'd love for you to keep in mind questions. We'll have time for that at the end, but for now, I'd love to hand it over to Karen to share with us what the experience was like for her and Sid at the UMCA.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here tonight. And 1 year later, we finally celebrate this program that I want to also thank the Campus Climate Improvement Grants from UMass and the entire staff of the UMCA and Sid Ferreira, who I'll introduce momentarily, for his take on the program, my co-facilitator, and all the students who were involved. We're going to hear from one of those students shortly before I introduce our guest speaker, who's going to present for the rest of the program tonight. So these are photographs from the Leonardo Drew exhibition last fall, 2019, when you could actually go to the UMCA, and you can now, but you have to get an appointment and wear a mask. In those days, we could all just show up for free and enjoy the exhibitions, but we wanted to invite students in who don't normally come to the museum. When I teach art history, we often talk about the museum as a kind of elite space, a space, historically affiliated with European and white American culture. Sometimes it's called a white sanctuary space. So we, museums and art history departments, are working very hard to reach different kinds of audiences and democratize that space and break those associations with historical elite culture. And that was the initiative for Making Art Yours. It came out of some other campus climate programs I was involved with as a campus climate ambassador for a brief period of time, and the discussions of race on campus at UMass that has increasingly impacted my own teaching and engagement. So I wanted to start this program to invite students in who don't normally study art and who don't consider the museum their space, who maybe haven't been to the UMCA before, as part of this general effort to increase awareness of the UMCA on campus. I think it's very underappreciated space. When Amanda told me about Look at Art, Get Paid, I was amazed by that program. And we decided to not only invite students in, but also and provide them food, because we have to provide dinner to have a real conversation with a group of students that don't know us. But we also decided to pay them a stipend as an art critic for the day. And that was a program directly inspired by Look at Art, Get Paid at RISD Art Museum. So you see us here meeting each other, talking to each other. We selected students from a large pool of applicants who were often first-generation college students, students who were not studying art, students of color, BPOC students, And we got a great group together for 3 different sessions. They were supposed to be 4, but because of the shutdown, there were only 3. And you can see we had them fill out their impressions of the museum before we even started to speak about the works. And then we sat down in a circle and had a kind of small group dialogue, intensively focused on one work of art. And we looked at that in detail using principles, visual thinking strategies. So just starting with what you see and then building out from the specificity of this object in front of us into students' own insights and students' own backgrounds and cultures and how they relate to it, to their studies, to anything they wanted to bring up. I was very amazed by the variety of perspectives I always learn from students when we talk about artwork. And I'm hoping this program really gave students an idea that they don't need a special background in art to come to the museum and to experience the work, that they have their own cultural resources that they can bring to it to interpret it with. So we practice close looking, we practice how to put what we see into words and all those skills that art history teaches us, but also just encouraging students to come in that don't normally see the museum as their space. So these are all photographs from the Leonardo Drew exhibition. We also, in the spring, had one session with Ronnie Horn's work and Prochita Mukherjee Olson. And that was a great session right before the COVID shut. I turn it over to Sid Ferreira and then Kiana Middleton Hart, one of the students who was involved in the program. So Sid was my co-facilitator, and he is the special assistant to the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Campus Life at UMass. I'm going to invite him on to share his thoughts on how the program went.
Good afternoon, or should I say good early evening. Thank you, Professor Kurczynski and Professor Herman, for inviting me to be part of this amazing project. As Karen said, my name is Sid Ferreira, and I serve as the Special Assistant to the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Campus Life here at UMass Amherst. I just want to say I want to give thanks for, I would be remiss by not saying that, to the jurors in the Derek Chauvin trial. I had a whole prepared statement, but I'm in somebody else's office right now, so I'm just going to go off the top of my head right now. But I want to give thanks to those jurors for coming up with a guilty verdict, because what we saw is what happened, and finally we started to see some remnants of justice for Black and brown folks here in the United States. But again, thank you for involving me in this project. I'm a social justice educator, so I came in to this project looking at it from a social justice point of view. I'm also, someone who's immigrant, someone who is a first-generation college student, who came out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is a very blue-collar community. And, art was not one of those things that were pushed upon us in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and in some of the communities that I came from, including in Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and in Portugal. And I got exposed to art at a very early age, working at the Augusta Savage Gallery when I was a student at UMass Amherst. So to be involved in this project was just an amazing opportunity to see people who are like me, to start learning about art and start appreciating art and being in a space that most of us folks of color a lot of times don't find ourselves in. And then to have somebody such as Professor Kurczynski, who is an expert in the art world, and some of the students who are also experts in some of those spaces, and to bring this fusion of students in to then talk about issues of not just analyzing art, but analyzing art from a social justice point of view was just special, I think, to all of us, not just myself, but a lot of the students who were students of color, were there, first generation college students who brought different types of identities to the space, just like a lot of our artists that are students are getting exposed, they also brought a lot of identities into the space. So to be able to talk about race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, environmental issues, and all of these were portrayed in the pieces of art that the students were evaluating. To see, the outcomes of what they said in their reflections, it showed that what being tried to be achieved in this space was actually achieved. Talking to the students during the session, after the session, and then again reading their evaluations and their reflections, it really showed that the space achieved, the program achieved what it set out to do, which is to bring people who traditionally don't look at art and to look at and appreciate it and have a space, a quiet space where you can reflect on not just the art, but how your life and your lived experiences can connect to that art. And me as the facilitator, I wasn't just a facilitator, I was also somebody who was learning from our students. And I learned a lot from everyone who was in there, learned a lot from Professor Kurczynski, because like I said, she's an expert in this, and to see the different point of views and to see the students analyze pieces and to come up with something that I had never thought about, and really looking at that piece and saying, well, actually, I don't see that. But once they explained it, I was like, yeah, actually, I could see that. Was just enriching for everyone who was in the space. So I truly appreciate this program. I truly appreciate all of the participants, to all the students who took a leap of faith to be part of this and to entrust both myself and Karen and Amanda to create a space where they could learn. I want to thank you for that. And again, I want to thank Karen and Amanda for putting these pieces together, and Josephine for being here, for creating a program such as this, because this has been invaluable, not only to the students who are part of this program, but to us. I'm hoping that this continues, that we can, as we go back to normal, we can create other spaces such as this for our students, because our students of color, first generation college students, need a space like this for them to reflect on their lived experience and how their lived experiences really connects to art and the world at large. So thank you, and I hope everyone has a great night and have some real good questions for us, because we'll be glad to participate and engage with you. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Sid. I love that you underscore the social justice point, which is the whole point of the project in relationship to art. So I want to bring on Kiana Middleton-Hart. If you're ready, you can just say a few words, whatever you want to share with us about your impressions of the program. I know you took some art history after the program, which was great. Maybe just tell us what you're studying and how it related to how it impacted your life.
Yes, hello. So during the program, I was actually an art major and with a double in psychology, and I had found out about the program in an email, and I just thought, oh, I've studied art before, I could just make a little bit of money. But when I actually got into the program, I didn't expect to have such a deep, profound conversation with students from other majors and different cultural backgrounds about the art. And usually when I had been studying art, it had been just on a class level. I had never thought in such a deep level. But when we actually got into the museum and we were all talking and hanging out, it turned into so much more. It turned into a real conversation between students that I would have never discussed art with. And it was so fascinating to hear their perspectives, because most of them didn't study art. They used their own personal backgrounds from where they're from or what they had actually been studying and how they related it to their own majors. And it was just such a fun night and an interesting experience. And I would have loved to do it again, but then shortly after, COVID happened, so we never got to do it again. But it was such a great experience. So thank you. And thank you for setting up such a fun program. It was so different to study art in such a outside the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiana. Yeah, it was really fun for me too to talk to people who aren't art majors. There were a lot of science majors, social science. We had like a really interesting mix. But at this point, maybe we could stop the slides, and I want to turn it over to our guest speaker, and I'm going to introduce her briefly tonight. So Josephine Devanbu is an interdisciplinary artist committed to collaborative and participatory art that models counter-institutions, alternative spaces, and resource redistribution. In collaboration with artist Maia Chao, Devanbu created Look at Art, Get Paid, a socially engaged artwork that pays people who don't visit art museums to visit one as a guest critic of the art and its institution. Devanbu and Chao have presented on the project internationally, both at art museums interested in adopting the program and at conferences ranging from the fields of visitor studies, social practice, equity in the museum field, to art education. She's based in Providence, Rhode Island, where she's joining us today from the Dirt Palace, which is a really interesting feminist collective and live workspace. So I'm going to turn it over to Josephine to discuss that program that inspired Making Art Yours.
Hi, so this is Josephine here. Thank you all so much for having me. It's really exciting and refreshing to hear about how some of the model that Maia and I have developed and worked with has kind of taken on a life through all of you. I'm calling in from Providence on occupied indigenous lands that are traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag people. Before I get started on talking about where Look at Art, Get Paid came from and what was really what was kind of in the mix that led Maia and I to kind of take this on and start in this direction. I just kind of taking in this particular moment, just with everything happening today, the trial, and then just also just the world that we're all in right now is a different one than the one that all of you last gathered in when you ran those initial groups of Making Art Yours. And it's just the pandemic and the kind of the racial reckoning of the last year have brought museums to a juncture of historic uncertainty and scrutiny, and also potential for reform. And the kind of cultural inspiration, affirmation, and experimentation that museums can provide their communities could not be more needed right now. And I hear that in what each of you are bringing up. Like, we really need space to gather and to process and to kind of try new things and to be messy and to figure out and to kind of chart a course. And then at the same time, the communities who have the lived expertise to guide these institutions and to guide us in finding liberatory futures for these spaces are also those hit hardest by the virus, on top of already being at greatest risk of premature death at the hands of the police state or racial capitalism. So we're kind of it's in some ways it's just, these are all the same dynamics that were present beforehand, but they are, it really is a different moment also in terms of what feels kind of like mainstream to talk about. And I'm gonna, in a moment, I'm gonna kind of jump back to the origin of Look at Art, Get Paid. And it is interesting just thinking about at that point, this idea of kind of naming coming to a historically white space and visiting it and kind of giving feedback on it. The idea of kind of calling visiting an art museum labor and paying people to do it felt it felt like kind of edgy or like a little bit uncomfortable and a little kind of radical in 2016. And it is really a different moment right now, and I think that that also means for Look at Art, Get Paid, and for what Maia and I are both kind of taking on now, thinking about, okay, what is what makes sense at this moment, and how do we kind of take the values of this and push it forward, and also and kind of push ourselves and also push you know, the museums and the communities that we're part of. So with that said, kind of I'm going to be today speaking kind of about some of the sort of behind the scenes aspects of putting together this project and what has unfolded from it. And then I'm also going to show two video clips that offer a chance to kind of bring you all into the space of the critics' visit to the RISD Museum, and then also back into the museum for some artistic interventions that our critics were curatorial advisors on. And sort of before and between those videos, I'll talk a little bit about what was kind of driving Maia and I and some of the things that surprised us and that emerged from that work. So before I show this first video, I'm just gonna just talk a little bit about kind of where this idea came out of. So Maia Chao and I are both from mixed race families, immigrant families. So Maia's family is white American and Chinese. I'm also half white, and then my dad's side is Tamil, so South Indian. And we also both grew up being in, like, feeling comfortable in museums and using those spaces, but also aware of who wasn't there. And at the point that Maia and I met, we were both like, we were committed to lives at least attempting to be artists, and you know, we knew that if we were lucky enough to kind of make it in some way in our fields, even then, you know, the spaces that we would likely to be, that we would probably be sort of trying to show our work in, wouldn't be reaching everybody. And I, you know, I think there was, you know, I think a feeling of like real discomfort and kind of sadness around that, and just this feeling of like having found art making ourselves, and you know, so many of you kind of already spoke to this, just the experience of being in a room with other people, with like whatever it is, an art object, a video, an experience, something that kind of like breaks some of, you know, that kind of cuts through the ordinary in some way, and kind of like makes this challenge. Like there's something about being in physical space with other people, and with like and with sort of a draft or a kind of like proposal or gesture, or, you know, it could be a sculpture, whatever it is, something that's fresh and that's challenging. That experience for me is I love it, and I love hearing what other people are seeing when they're in a room like that. And I actually love the process of critique like that, you know, for me, and you know, being around other artists, for me, critique is love. Like it's being there for somebody, it's being real with them, and it's about, you know, just kind of actually sharing, you know, our the different experiences that we're having. So, you know, this was something that we both really cared about, but when we were kind of wondering, like, okay, does it have to be this way, or like, could we bring in, like, is there a way that we could actually have these conversations with more people at the table and not have it be sort of so, you know, constricted to people that are already kind of like in this world. So we also happened to both have studied social science, and we were interested in like sort of the questions around what is an expert, and sort of who becomes an expert, and what does it take to be an expert. And so I think like that's kind of where we came in with Look at Art, Get Paid, was thinking about, you know, is there, like, what if we kind of flip this on its head a little bit, and thought and brought in people who have the lived expertise of having actually some critical distance from this space to come in as experts, and actually to kind of come in a way as ethnographers, as well as art critics, and look at the space around them and kind of take it in and offer their knowledge about it. So I'm gonna in a second ask to play the video, but the one last piece is, we did, before we had folks come in, we did an interview with each critic ahead of time and talked to them about their current cultural intake and what they were interested in, and just really wanting to make sure it was on the table and clear that this was not a program trying to educate people or trying to turn them into museum goers. It's a program really trying to get information that's missing from a discourse because of historic things about who these spaces have centered in the past. So with that, let's play the first video.
I think people with money, they do museums. They have a certain way, a certain culture. They get into the museum. People in our community, we wasn't taught by our parents, like, go to the museum. Mm-hmm. It was either go to the library, go to school. We were limited what we could do. And as growing up, I guess it goes from that generation down, and maybe it's because it wasn't advertised. Who knows? I would have never had that opportunity to take my grandson. So maybe he'll remember that, or maybe he wants to go again. And that's something that he could be educated in, and he could teach his family.
Art promises to bring about change, but many art institutions still serve the elite. Museums receive public money to serve the public, but they hear from and answer to the people who show up, a small segment of the population that doesn't reflect the whole. To truly serve the public, museums must understand what their galleries feel like to the demographic majority outside their current visitor base. It turns out, this isn't easy. Free days aren't enough to bring in new voices. Studies show they usually serve people who already visit museums. Beyond the admission fee, a trip to a museum can incur transportation, food, and childcare expenses, alongside the opportunity cost of time diverted from work or leisure. This is a lot to ask, especially if you're not sure what you find in the museum will reflect your lived experience or heritage. Look at Art, Get Paid is an arts research program that pays people who rarely, if ever, go to art museums to visit one as a guest critic. Critics share their time and expertise on what the museum looks and feels like from the perspective of a newcomer. Cash payment ensures that critics leave the museum with a currency that holds value across all intersections of race and class within our capitalist system. The program was created by a small independent group of visual artists and researchers. The first iteration took place at the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design, a comprehensive art museum in Providence, Rhode Island. Critics were paid with institutional funds from various academic divisions at RISD. The program was advertised in English and Spanish on public buses, and a final 41 participants were selected. Priority was given to those who had never been to a museum, along with people of color. Historically, museums have sought to enlighten and civilize a public. Look at Art, Get Paid asks, how can the museum be enlightened by those who are not presently served by it?
I'm from the North End, and it's pretty isolated. So you come down here, it's really busy, and it seems, the word bougie, I guess. And you come down here, you think, it's just artsy kids, and they're gonna look at you all weird because you got your Jordans on and stuff. But I'd say once you hit Broad Street on a certain side, nobody's really coming downtown to see, because I think the museum, you got to pay $25, $45 to get in, which really isn't the case, but they don't know, so they're not going to look to go down that avenue.
I've lived in Providence good 40 years, and I never knew this was a museum. And I come by this street a lot.
So I never felt like, oh, okay, I guess it's not necessarily not a public space, but maybe it's just not a space for me.
I'm really glad that I did come today because I was like, I never knew. And there was a picture by Jean Metzinger over here, and there wasn't enough free paper to see all the things I've seen. That one photograph, but I will take a picture and send it to Walgreens and put it in my living room and post the size. That picture just kept calling me.
I'd get closer to some of the pieces. I'm like, stupid tea kettles thing or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, what the hell is this? And then I'm like, wow, there's such cool little like art in this. And I'm like, maybe it's not something that I would have bought or something like that, you know, at the time or even now, you know. But as a tea set, but as a piece of art, it would be something cool.
And then there's just another thing that I did ask one of the guards. You know that table? I'm sure a lot of you liked it. That's out there. I asked him if you could purchase, if anybody, you know, there's rich people that might come to the museums and have a lot of money. And I said, if I ever win the Powerball, I'm coming to get that table. So I asked him, can you purchase any of the displays? And he said, no. But you know, when you got money, I'll work around that. Just saying.
The first thing that happened to me was I went and set off an alarm. I wasn't even doing anything. I just like was looking, I was leaning too far and the alarm goes off and I'm like, oh my God.
I just am so afraid that I'm going to do something wrong. Like, I don't want to mess with anybody's art. I don't want to break anything. I don't want to be disrespectful. So I'm really hesitant to like interact with things unless I get something telling me like it's okay.
Because I really didn't see like a lot of inner city people here. Only just like people who, you know, can afford pieces like this in their house or to go to these schools. If like somebody who came here, you know, just Spanish speaking, they wouldn't know where to go or like what any of the descriptions were saying. And I felt like, oh, you know, that could have been me or anyone.
Because I was just looking at them, I like it or I don't like it. And then I stopped to read them. And once I read them, I actually liked it a lot more. So the more I read, the more I understood, the more I enjoyed.
Te capto el nombre y la fecha, pero se supone que es algo histórico que por eso está aquí, pero eso no lo puedo captar.
Encuentras el autor, encuentras el título, pero cuando vas al año, tú te confundes porque el autor tiene un año, el título tiene otro año, y cuando tú lees la historia tiene otros años, tú dices, ¿en cuándo se hizo?
Tú sabes, si tuviera como ciertas palabras clave hasta en inglés, uno podría deducir, aunque fuera en inglés, pero que uno puede deducir que es por el poco idioma que uno...
Claro.
O no sé si es que el museo está dirigido a otro tipo de persona.
For my personal home culture, no, there was no like representation.
Same.
I mean, because I'm Afro-Caribbean and I didn't see much African art and I did not see any Caribbean art or even Caribbean artists really being represented. So for me, if I were to go to a museum and I see that stuff, that automatically excites me and stuff. But I didn't
see any. I'm Cuban, so I didn't see any either Mexican or Central American.
I'm Dominican, and I would have loved to see anything Spaniard or Latin American. Heck, I would have been happy with seeing something even from Brazil. I understand that, you know, like sometimes it can come down to the cost, but it feels weird given that Rhode Island has such a high population of Latin American culture that there's very little representation, but yet constantly there's this talk of, you know, everyone's equally represented or, hey, we're all for equality. I think it has to start with art. Art is like our most intimate expression of who we are as people, and I'd love to see just more international work, period.
It was just like an everyday thing for me. I'm going outside, I walk up the street and I see tags on the floor, on the ground. I'll see tags on a mailbox and it's just, who is that? What are they about? You know, their street credibility, so to speak. And it's just going through a museum. It's the same thing. How highly regarded is this artist? Even looking down there, there's graffiti right there and you could just see it on the wall and you could just go down the stairs or, you know, look at high art, I guess. And it's just, who dictates where art should be?
And here are your 2 guest passes. Come back.
$75 is a lot of money to serve people. I mean, even now, you can get a lot with $75, but at the end of the day, there are paintings that cost $15 million or a painting that cost $25 million, and then they're sitting right in front of you, and it's just puts things into perspective.
to help me like get to the next point in my life to be able to move forward and just, you know, have some extra cash in my pocket, whereas I really needed it at the time.
Tal vez si no me ofrecen que me van a pagar, tal vez no vengo. Pero después que estoy aquí, como no la pasamos bien, no podemos escapar.
Most museums were built and curated under white leadership and center white narratives of history, value, and beauty. The RISD Museum's mission states, "We aspire to create an accessible and inclusive environment that builds meaningful relationships across all communities." An overwhelming majority of critics said they were moved by their visit to the museum, and yet their sense of belonging was limited by the museum's collection and the cultural standards of the space. The creators of the project are working to communicate the critiques of the museum to those in power. They are also seeking collaborators and partners to connect to the larger community of artists, activists, and museums working to effect structural change in art and its institutions.
Hi. So, okay, sweet. So we presented this video to the full staff of the RISD Museum about a year after we ran the program. And that was, both being in the room with the critics talking about their experiences at the museum, and then also being in that all staff meeting screening this video, were just two experiences that were really new for me. Like it was just to have that experience of like really having these conversations that had felt kind of like in the background up till then, and then just being able to like really dive right in and just like look at it and talk about it was a really powerful experience for me, and I think it was also for RISD Museum staff. And one of the things that really came up in the conversation was just the experience of hearing directly from people, especially for staff whose jobs don't involve contact with visitors, and especially new visitors daily. Just the experience of hearing directly, like, oh, okay, like these type decisions or these decisions about how big labels are or how labels are organized or whether things are translated have really concrete emotional and kind of communicative impact for visitors. One of the things that came up in that staff conversation was this kind of tension around the museum's role as a steward of its collection and kind of protecting these objects, and also its role as a place for people to come together as a kind of education center, as a kind of center for use. And there was this one critic statement that really kind of kicked this conversation off, and that was a guest critic noting they're taking better care of the paintings than of us, which is kind of certainly kind of heartbreaking, or just a very it hits a nerve. And one of the staff members at the museum used that as a jumping off point to talk about the ways that the museum's budget could be looked at as a kind of map of what do we care about, what are our priorities, and sort of just looking at it that way, like what amount of our budget is going towards things that are about that are visitor centered, and what part of it is directed towards security or register or these other aspects. So I think that being in that room and what it opened up was it was a very a lively conversation, and a kind of exhibition designer seeing that video, taking in her own aesthetic decisions with seeing the guest critics moving through the space, brought up that her decision to match the mannequins in the museum's 20th century gallery with the white walls, which had felt like an aesthetic decision at the time, just kind of reducing visual noise, of course, had narrative implications and implications about who would feel like they were the implicit subject there or the other. So in addition to working with museum staff and the RISD Museum, all of these conversations, are already in the mix. For them, these are things that they're aware of and working on. But I think that this project, I think, came in some kind of activating ways in terms of opening up conversations and kind of turning up the heat on some initiatives that were already underway. So, for example, the museum was already working on, translating its brochures into a wider array of languages. But, some of those things, I think, came together a little faster. The museum also expanded the neighborhoods that it was doing advertising in. And in the subsequent years, hosted several exhibitions that focused on works from the collection, but also contemporary works by Latinx artists in Rhode Island. In addition to kind of stewarding critic knowledge to the museum, Maia and I also wanted to work directly with critics to address some of their own ideas, in addition to things that the critics shared in the video clip that I shared. People also really got like brainstorming right after that clip where people were talking about not seeing work from their heritage. Folks started thinking about like ways that they might get involved in community budgeting, or thinking about properties that they were aware of, and how like maybe there could be some kind of ballot measure passed that would set aside some money that was like specifically for collecting local work. Another critic, who was a sign maker by trade, was just like, we need a clearer sign here, and he was sort of thinking in that way. Another critic was a community organizer, was thinking about brainstorming barbecues, just thinking about how the space that people really did feel a connection to, and yet there was that, of course, that this very present boundary in so many cases, and people just really jumping in and diving into thinking about how the space could be sort of wrangled into something that would feel more like home. So this next video clip is another way that we sort of continued to work with critics and with others in the community. So we can play that.
So we have the opportunity now to invite critics from our pilot program back into the museum to serve as curatorial advisors and collaborators on new commissions that take their critiques and bring them to the public.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Shay Rivera.
My name is Laura Rosado.
So we're going to share with you, if you would like to be part of this collective reading and collective performance, we created a response to Tavares Strachan's piece, You Belong Here, and asked the community, what do you actually feel like you need to belong? Because this is a really heavy statement and has a lot of deep meaning for many of us, coming from different intersections, different places of being. So this booklet that you have in your hand has a collection of many community members that have collaborated with Look at Art, Get Paid, and also other local folks here from the community. And if you could come join us in this reading, that would be amazing.
One of the first pieces of art you see when you first walk into the museum's entrance is a neon sign by RISD alum and board member Tavares Strachan.
There are many other artists that have treated the theme of belonging. I felt like not enough of them were hitting straight to the point of what people truly need.
I am recognized as a local in my community regardless of my accent, my skin color, or where I was born.
Who reads next? Popcorn style, whatever you feel.
I can switch freely between English and Español con mis amigas.
Mi cultura está representada por gente de mi propia cultura.
White supremacy is not welcome.
My kids are welcome.
history of segregation is acknowledged.
My disability is not a burden.
I see people that look like me.
Hearing the words being said out loud in the space was a really meaningful experience. I at least felt like there was a sense of unity and there was a commitment.
I feel like I belong when people accept how I looked, accept the way I speak, and simply accept who I am.
So I started clowning in 1998. I decided to go with my mom to the hospital to see kids. So give that little bit of hope. And then I decided to take classes. And eventually, it's been a lot of years.
Our critic, Laudilim Rosado, is preparing a performance where she walks through the different galleries in full clowning costume. And that kind of presence is a way to bring some levity to the space.
I just am so afraid that I'm going to do something wrong. Like, I don't want to mess with anybody's art. I don't want to break anything. I don't want to be disrespectful. I'm really hesitant to like interact with things unless I get something telling me like it's okay.
I really didn't see like a lot of inner city people here, only just like people who, you know, can afford pieces like this in their house or to go to these schools.
So I never felt like, oh, okay, I guess it's not really, maybe it's just not a space for me.
Laudilim had experiences in the museum where she felt like she could acknowledge the strangeness of the codes of the museum in her practice as a clown.
Beep, 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 beep.
What? I have nothing.
You know, one shoe is fine, two shoes is fine.
I'm Mariana Rodriguez, and I'm somebody who, you know, doesn't go to the RISD Museum. There's cameras everywhere, there's guards. I didn't know there were guards in the museum. You get looked at differently when they know you're not, you know, a regular there, because you're looking at it, you're trying to take it in for what it is, you know, the history and the passion behind it, but you still don't feel like it was meant for you to enjoy.
So we brainstormed making this like pretty on the nose visual of security that I was hoping would translate, just like translate, like you didn't need a translation. It's not super academic.
Do you feel safe in the museum?
I'm more worried about like perception. Like, what are they thinking of me being here? Like, is she bored? Is she lost?
Do we need to put in metal detectors?
Do we need to put the metal detectors? Like, is she gonna keep that beanie on the whole time?
Our web intervention takes notes, drawings, even sound bites from critics and puts them directly in conversation with the museum's institutional voice by annotating its website.
The coffin and mummy of Nesmeen.
Stephen McCants Jr. is the advisor on that intervention.
Yeah, so seeing my handwriting on here is similar to seeing it somewhere where it shouldn't be. Like, I mean, as bad as it is to say, I don't want to say my handwriting doesn't belong on the RISD Museum's website.
Stephen is also a graffiti artist.
The one that's faded out right there, the reason why it's faded out is because nobody's touched it. And that's like mad respect. It's hella props. Going into the museum, it's like, I know I'm going into a space where people have probably poured a lot of money in to get these pieces in here. I think graffiti's just more inclined to be organic than an institution.
I used to write the museum website when I was in San Francisco working for a museum. Often these kinds of things are inaccessible, either in language or the design isn't very accessible. I mean, it's intimidating even, you know, the aesthetic of it can feel like you don't belong.
Right.
been living in Providence for about a year, but I've never come here because I've never seen any signs that said we have this exhibit or that exhibit.
I've lived in Providence good 30, 40 years. I never knew this was a museum.
Our signage intervention imagines what it might look like for the museum to turn to the advertising strategies of auto dealerships and beauty salons to address its challenges reaching a wider public.
When I look at the building, I just keep going because I look at it as college students doing their thing, doing their art. Didn't feel welcome.
We are working with Deborah Harris, who is a critic from our pilot.
I work for DARE, Direct Action Rights for Equality.
We want to sort of question, what does a museum sign aim to communicate and who is it communicating to?
Oops. Hello. So I think we can sort of pause here and go into questions and just take it wherever folks are interested in going.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Josephine. Really loved getting the background of that project because I've seen that video once before, but it was great to hear kind of what led to that. And then so exciting to see that kind of second phase and how I love that you were able to bring back the original critics and do these really incredible interventions that I think just really enact, the goal of your project in a really creative and exciting way. So I was really excited to see that. So we definitely have questions for you. I think the first one is more maybe personal in terms of you and Maia and how this project kind of connects to your art making practice and your studies, your MFA studies, and how do you go kind of forth in the world with these, I don't know if you see them as two separate pieces to yourself, or how do you balance kind of the social justice activism, the look at art, get paid stuff with maybe your artistic practice?
Yeah. It's definitely it feels integrated, and I think it's something that's I think been really interesting to have as a practice and to be approaching as an artist, alongside also doing studio work and kind of engaging in these different ways, and also asking questions about what makes this artwork as opposed to something else, and sort of questions about is this like sort of really being rigorous about asking in what ways is this actually art, like an artist project, and what is what are the parameters of it, and when does it like enter into something else. And I think that's a lot of working on the project has been about thinking about what we aren't doing, as well as what we are doing, and kind of even as a big part of what the project has brought into both of our lives is, I think, just kind of diving headfirst. Right while we were still both in college. I was actually an undergrad. Maia was doing her MFA. And just kind of immediately diving into something that was real and that was interfacing with, institutions that we'd never, I didn't dream of like being in conversation with, the kinds of spaces and the kind of people that this project brought me in conversation with. And so amidst all of that, I think, also being really clear about what was our lane and what was outside that, and being clear that this, this is an artist project. It isn't a kind of, this isn't something that's going to stand in place for, actually working with community organizers and actually, doing that long-term work of, of like building those connections and redirecting a space. So yeah, I think, I don't know if that kind of hits on some of it.
Yeah, definitely. I can see how that defining the parameters being pretty key. But also, being open to breaking them, and seeing where it could lead, because it really could transform in a different way maybe than you set out to. I think Sid would love to follow up with another question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for those videos. Those are amazing videos. And thank you for also putting the expression people speaking in Spanish, right? The expressing in their native language. I think that is important for people to see and to attract folks back to the museum. My question is, have you seen the folks who were part of the video or others who have come since then? Have they come back to the space? You know, I know COVID kind of disrupted that somewhat. Some of them, have they engaged? Have they come back to volunteer? Have you seen like a different types of vibe in the space since this whole program got created?
Thank you, Sid. And yeah, just it's so nice to just be like in this weird like quasi together state. It's still just like really lovely to share whatever this space is with each of you. So we did see actually, even while the program was going, like on one of the later days, we saw one of the critics who'd come like a few days earlier, like coming with what I think we could all reasonably conclude was a date back at the museum just a few days later, like very confidently kind of, you know, like directing the other party around. I have definitely seen other critics back at the museum. I also crossed paths with one critic on the bus, and she told me that she had taken the project and adapted it to use with her 5th grade class. So she had kind of, you know, made a version of the handbook and brought her class in as experts. And yeah, so and then in terms of the museum and who's been present at the museum, it really has changed over the past few years. This project is one, like, you know, small piece in that, but really there have been moments where the space was actually really not like where people who were normally regulars were on the periphery. There have been some moments like that where people have come in, and especially for, you know, kind of more pop-up kind of events, there have been moments where it's like, this is actually this is like this local artist and then like all of their friends from high school, and they're like this is what's happening here right now, and like I have to kind of like stand here for a while before like someone will like be willing to chat with me, because they're all having this really lively, you know, conversation about, you know, catching up with each other. And it's just to feel awkward in that way, in that space, was just like magical. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You know, I think if it wasn't for COVID that interrupted part of what we were doing here, we probably would have seen the same thing. So I'm hoping that as we open up next fall, that we will see the same thing that you're seeing in your space. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Josephine. I just wanted to follow up with a couple questions, combining with some from the audience. There's one from a grad student in our department, Jill Hughes. What advice do you have for museums with a smaller budget and a smaller community who hope to invite and empower new art critics in the way that your work has done? And I'm curious if that links up to experiences you've had at other museums, because I know you're doing this as consultants in a way in other contexts. So anything related to that?
Thank you for that. Yeah. So as you all were just starting, you know, as you all were, you know, bringing folks in for making art yours, right? Kind of in February, Maya and I were ramping up for what had really been like several years in the making, a partnership with the Massachusetts Cultural Council. We were going to be starting with a kind of cohort of museums who would be bringing in guest critics, and then also kind of doing the kind of art intervention follow-up, as well as more like as in coordination with more kind of longer term community connecting work that Maya and I wouldn't ourselves be directing, but that would be kind of happening in parallel. So we had a kind of like really kind of, it was like a multi-year plan, and it was by partnering with the Massachusetts Cultural Council, it was possible to actually to make it accessible to museums a different range of budget. So that was kind of how that piece was fitting in. And the other thing about that partner was that, you know, they have this, you know, long-term work of also kind of communities department. So also, you know, having these, you know, having other people as part of the team, like existing, you know, resources that aren't like within our budget and also might not be within the museum's budget, that could actually kind of come in at the same time and you know, really kind of actually bring the necessary, you know, scale of work. So, you know, that has, you know, COVID, like, you know, just the timing of that and the way that the state budget works and the, you know, just all of the uncertainty inserted has, you know, that is like no longer, or it's, you know, we've been on a freeze. And I think that kind of like that opportunity as it was, you know, going to play out, I don't think will be or won't take that form. So in terms of the question about museums with smaller budgets and what they can do. So the first thing that comes to mind is I don't feel like an expert in this question. I guess what comes to mind, the things that come to mind for me are join groups like Mass Action. So that's Museum as Site for Social Action. It's a really incredible kind of national, with folks across the country, group of museum professionals who are really dedicated to the long-term work of doing anti-racism organizing within the fields. And they have, their website is, I think it's massaction.org. And they have an incredible toolkit, which is free, and like it's just kind of a miracle that these people produce this like after their working hours. But that toolkit kind of has a model for how it could be used to kind of do reading groups with a museum, and also how to think about, you know, different the different kind of leadership, what leadership might be thinking about, what boards might need to think about. So that toolkit would kind of be the first resource that I would point folks to. And then, I mean, the other thing I would say is like also looking at museum workers speak, looking at like labor organizing that's happening, looking at like mutual aid work, and really, I think just like connecting with other people who have been doing this long term. And I think I think also thinking about like starting with your own staff, starting with the museum's own staff, and making sure that marginalized staff, you know, at the museum are able to like be sharing their own expertise, and that, you know, that they're well and like in okay health, and like their work isn't, you know, harming their health. So those are, you know, just some thoughts about, but again, it's not my area of expertise, but I think some of I think, you know, if you start looking at Mass Action's work, some of the people that are involved in that are really, I think, a great place to look for where anybody in the field could take some steps.
Yeah, it seems like the smaller museums often are more in social contact between the different departments, that people play multiple roles, and maybe they're even better situated in some cases to do that kind of work, because those hierarchies get really, really, you know, enshrined in the larger museums, especially with labor issues and the culture of the workplace. So yeah, those are definitely good ideas. There was another question about next steps for the project, but I guess you've started to talk about that, and it's a little bit up in the air, right? With the with the grant and this COVID and but you're going to continue in some way, right? I mean,
so I can share. Yeah, I mean, in this moment, for me, it's been a chance to be more part of groups like Mass Action, and kind of take in what they're doing, and just like learn in that way, and be reading and be kind of like processing. And like what I'm finding a lot of inspiration in right now, and what I'm kind of in a planning stage of is thinking about what what does this moment make possible, and also what is possible right now given people's health and bandwidth and just like exhaustion, and thinking about what can I do, kind of in the same way that I was thinking, while I was, an undergrad, like given my position, the funds, or, what funding I do have access to, like what can I do to kind of open something up that's a little bit more, that's generous in some way, and that is like pushes a little bit our kind of expectations about what makes sense to pay people to do. So, I mean, right now I'm feeling really inspired by the work of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, and their work about study as something that all people are engaged in, study as something that's happening at the barbecue, happening on the factory floor. That this kind of, work of cultural critique is really belongs to all of us. And thinking about what I'm interested in right now is thinking about, can I pay people, can I direct, whether it's state money or foundation money, can I pay people who are both in museums and then also on the outskirts of using those institutions, to just hang out and talk and recover, and maybe on hour 2, when they've actually had something to eat and unwind a little bit, dream and think about what could actually happen, what would actually feel affirming, what would it actually look like for these spaces to meet some of the needs and some of the healing and some of the re-energizing that people need, and kind of taking that more as a grounding point rather than starting with the institution. So that's what's feeling exciting for me, and just thinking about we have to recover, and that has to be part of the tempo of how we work right now and how we think together.
I like that answer a lot. I mean, I think it is a whole new world, and there is going to be a new, there's such a need for that, for listening and gathering conversation and kind of reimagining, where we can go. We're getting close to the end. I have one more great question from the audience, and then we'll kind of wrap up with thinking about how we're gonna take it forward at the UMCA a little bit. So this last question is from James Golden, and he says, museum collections have been built over generations, and if normal acquisition practices are maintained, it'll take a long time for them to reflect society's diversity proportionately. How do we address the urgency of this transformation? Hard question.
I actually think maybe that's a good question to start us in opening up to the group, because I think it's a really interesting question, but I actually feel like I might need help with the rest of you to think about it. But I mean,
I just immediately thought of the interventions that you provided, those artistic interventions with the pairing of the artist with a critic, and how that is like a fast way to respond and to in an unexpected way bring in new ideas and kind of overlay a new conversation, which I think could happen along with, of course, diversifying collections and changing kind of the way that museums acquire work. So that seems like a place to start, like one good way to begin.
And I would add, I think looking at budgets as a kind of site of meaning making and culture in of themselves, and just thinking about okay, where what are the funds that we do have access to, and how can we, what is within our power, within what we're able to do, within what our board is able to do, to use that funding to move this museum in a direction towards something liberatory that actually is able to do the kind of cultural work that is urgent in that community. And that might look like hiring, changes in hiring, changes in in like even, you know, what the traditional kind of like budget lines are. Like maybe it's, you know, maybe it's more resources going to like, you know, more open-ended like artist commissions in that area, or, you know, I think kind of like starting there would be a thought.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah. And then Karen, maybe you could just, as kind of a closing statement, think about, you know, the success of Making Out Yours, your hopes and dreams for the future of that, and you know, in some ways, Making Out Yours again was another type of intervention, obviously inspired by Look at Art, Get Paid, but a way to, with a relatively small budget, kind of start to do that work that's so key and so important, and that we're so committed to doing at the UMCA. But could you kind of offer some thoughts of how you could envision it going from here, or what you'd want to see?
Yeah, I want to continue always doing programs like it in some way. And I've brought it into my classes this year. As you know, Amanda and I have been collaborating for a contemporary art class where we're doing a new social engagement project where we're working with local high schools, and we're doing it on Zoom for the time being. Hopefully next year we can do it in the museum. Reaching out to high school classes, both social justice classes at the Paulo Freire Academy and art classes at a couple different schools, and the Upward Bound program at UMass, and trying to get my college students in dialogue with the high school students and talking. We're doing close looking with Allison Sarr's works that are on display right now, and Amanda's exhibition, We Are for Freedoms, with the social justice posters, encouraging people, you know, to look closely at artwork and realize that, you know, they can make connections again. It's been really fun to see my students open up and really see the other side of getting a group to speak, and how the high school students relate to the college students, and just any way of creating those dialogues is kind of what I live for as an art professional. So I will continue to try to get different types of audiences into that space, whether it's through a revival of Making Art Yours, or, you know, other ways that I can work with my own students in classes. I think everything needs to happen, you know, on multiple levels. These changes have to happen on every level at once. You know, we're hoping the museum someday will have a more prominent space on campus, so we can really, like, you know, people will realize it's there, because even the other faculty on campus don't realize it's there. It's such a innovative space. The exhibitions are really great. The programs are great. It's free. So, you know, I think I'm, you know, brainstorming constantly of what else we can do. So Sid, should we do it again?
Absolutely. I would love to see this again. I mean, this is just the beginning. I think it just has opened up doors to so many of us, you know, and so many of our students, that if this continues, it can just build up, you know, becomes part of the culture at UMass, and it can only go up from there.
Yeah, these students, I mean, the ones who joined, often they wanted to study art, but they couldn't. You know, they're like studying the sciences, they're studying economics and history and stuff that's more practical, but they just like had this, they wanted to be in an art space, and now they had a reason to be in an art space. So if we can create those opportunities on this campus, there's a huge audience that would be in that museum. So I definitely think there's a lot of potential for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's also just thinking about this moment. It's been just looking back at the Works Progress Administration and the artist project, and there's a precedent in this, 10,000 artists were hired and supported, through these programs. These things are possible, and I think, we had this experience in 2008 with, money just being this incredibly elastic thing. And I think we're having that experience again, in as the nation sort of tries to recover after the pandemic. And there's a little bit of that sense of elasticity that's actually hitting our regular people's bank accounts. And I'm my feeling, in all of this is just, every person has vision and a universe, and I just want to see all of it funded. I just want to see everybody get to make their experiment happen. And I know that there's
that money and whatever like tiny cushion it's offered is like nothing compared to like what people have suffered. But I am excited about like what some of these like chances to have a little bit of unemployment for a period or just some money, what that's made possible for people. Yeah, just getting to be part of an open-ended thinking, and have, you know, some money coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an incredibly hopeful way for us to wrap up tonight. And again, I just want to thank the Campus Climate Improvement Grant that we received to fund Making Out Yours. I want to thank both Karen and Sid for their tireless work and their generosity to our students. I really want to thank Josephine and the work that you do in the world, and thanks for inspiring us. And we're very excited to invite all of you to the museum. Just a plug for some of the exhibitions that Karen mentioned. They are online, so if you're not a UMass staff, faculty, or student, you can find all of the exhibitions online, and then we'll be opening again in the fall hopefully to everybody. And so please check out our website. And thanks to the Art History Department for supporting this as well. And I hope everybody has a really fantastic evening, and thanks for coming. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you all so much, and just thanks from both me and Maya for taking this idea on and for taking it this beautiful place that you have. So it's really lovely to be here and be part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.